I can't do this." Hardy's words from 30 minutes earlier still echoed in her mind as she sat at the altar. "I'm sorry, Jillian. I can't." "My son deserves a wife." Monique's voice rang through the sanctuary, sharp enough to shatter stained glass. "Not a charity case in a wheelchair." And standing above her, pointing like she was something contaminated, was Monique Clark, her fiancé's mother. The sound of gasping whispers echoed through St. Catherine's Church on the morning of June 3, 2023. It wasn't the happy murmur of wedding guests admiring a beautiful bride. It was the sharp, cruel hiss of scandal. Jillian Johnson sat frozen in her wheelchair at the altar, her lace wedding gown pristine white against the dark wood of the pews. Her veil trembled as she tried to steady her breathing. Around her, 150 guests stared. Some covered their mouths, others simply gawked. But before she could escape, a man she'd never met walked through those church doors holding a 6-year-old girl who had Jillian's face. He said the car crash that paralyzed her 7 years ago wasn't an accident. The baby they told her was dead had been alive this whole time, and the woman who'd just humiliated her had paid $20,000 to make sure Jillian never made it to a wedding at all. Now it was time for the truth, and it was going to destroy everyone who'd tried to bury it. Before we dive into this story, kindly tell us in the comment where you are watching from. The priest stood paralyzed mid-ceremony. Hardy, Jillian's fiancé, the man who'd promised to love her through everything, stood silent beside his mother. He wouldn't meet Jillian's eyes. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Instead, it had become her public execution. Jillian's hands shook on the arms of her wheelchair. The church felt smaller by the second, the walls closing in, the whispers growing louder. She wanted to disappear, to roll herself out of this nightmare and wake up somewhere else. Anywhere else. She was gathering what remained of her dignity to leave when the massive oak doors at the back of the church swung open with a bang that silenced every whisper. A man walked in, tall, commanding, dressed in an immaculate black suit that spoke of wealth and power. He wasn't alone. On either side of him, holding his hands, were 2 little girls in crimson dresses, identical twins with dark hair and serious eyes. Every head turned. The murmuring stopped completely. The man's gaze swept the church with cold authority before landing on Monique, still standing over Jillian with her finger extended. Then his eyes found Jillian herself, and something in his expression softened just slightly. "Stop this circus," the man said, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. "Do you have any idea who you're humiliating?" He walked down the aisle with steady, purposeful steps, the 2 girls following close beside him. When he reached Jillian, he did something unexpected. He knelt beside her wheelchair, placed one hand gently over her trembling fingers, and looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. "Hello, Jillian," he said quietly. "My name is Richard Baker, and I think it's time you met your daughter." The church erupted. Gasps, shouts. Monique's face drained of color, but Jillian couldn't hear any of it. Her eyes had locked onto one of the little girls, the one with brown eyes that mirrored her own. The child stared back at her with recognition that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. "My daughter?" Jillian's voice cracked. "But I thought—" "She survived," Richard said simply. "They told you she didn't, but Dorothy survived the crash, and she's been looking for you ever since." The stranger's voice echoed through the marble hall like thunder breaking through shame. Every head in St. Catherine's Church had turned toward Richard Baker, but he seemed utterly unbothered by the attention. His focus remained fixed on Jillian, kneeling beside her wheelchair with the kind of quiet authority that made powerful men and women alike fall silent. "You don't deserve this," he said, his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear, but the acoustics of the sanctuary carried his words like a benediction. Jillian stared at him, unable to form words. Her mind was still trying to catch up with what was happening. This man, this stranger, had walked into her nightmare and stopped it cold with nothing more than his presence and a few words. "Richard?" Hardy's voice cracked from somewhere behind her. "What are you doing here?" Richard didn't immediately acknowledge him. Instead, he rose to his feet with fluid grace, his hand still resting gently on Jillian's shoulder, and turned to face the congregation with an expression that could have frozen hell itself. "Richard Baker," someone whispered from the pews. "That's Richard Baker." The name rippled through the church like electricity. Even Jillian had heard of him. Baker Holdings, real estate, technology, philanthropy. A man whose net worth was discussed in business magazines with a mixture of awe and envy. What was someone like that doing at a wedding that was currently imploding in the most spectacular fashion possible? "You're Hardy's godfather," Monique said, and there was something triumphant in her voice now, as if she believed Richard's presence somehow validated her position. "Thank goodness you're here. You can help us resolve this unfortunate situation with discretion." Richard's gaze shifted to her, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Discretion," he repeated, the word dripping with contempt. "Is that what you call publicly humiliating a woman on what should be the happiest day of her life?" Monique's confident expression flickered. "Now, Richard, you don't understand the full situation. This girl, her name is Jillian Johnson," Richard cut her off, "and I suggest you start using it." Behind Richard, the two little girls who'd entered with him peered around his legs, their identical faces watching the scene with solemn, intelligent eyes. They couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, and they wore matching crimson gowns with small white flowers tucked into their dark hair. Jillian found her attention drawn to them, particularly to the one on Richard's right. There was something about her face, something familiar that Jillian couldn't quite place. The child's eyes were a deep, rich brown, the same shade Jillian saw every morning in her own mirror. "These are my daughters," Richard said, noticing Jillian's gaze. He reached down and gently guided both girls forward. Dorothy and Yvonne. The one called Dorothy stepped closer to Jillian's wheelchair, her small face tilted upward in open curiosity. She didn't look away or seem uncomfortable with the wheelchair like so many children did. Instead, she stared at Jillian with an intensity that felt oddly knowing. "You're pretty," Dorothy said softly, "even though you're crying." Something in Jillian's chest cracked a little wider. "Thank you, sweetheart." "This is all very touching," Monique interjected, her voice sharp with barely concealed irritation. "But I fail to see what business this is of yours, Richard. Hardy has made his choice, difficult as it was. She looks pitiful even with pity from a billionaire." The words landed like a slap. Several guests gasped. Hardy made a weak sound of protest that died in his throat when his mother shot him a silencing look. Richard's expression transformed into something dangerous. "Mrs. Smith," he said, and his voice had gone so cold that several people in the front pews actually leaned back. "You have no idea what you've done today." Monique opened her mouth to respond, but Richard held up a hand. "Not another word. I mean it." The authority in his voice was absolute. Monique closed her mouth, though her face flushed with anger. Richard turned back to Jillian, and his expression softened again, that same gentleness returning. "We need to talk, privately." "I don't understand," Jillian managed, her voice hoarse from crying. "Why are you here? How do you even know who I am?" "It's a long story," Richard said, "one that's going to be difficult to hear, but you need to hear it." He glanced at Dorothy again, something complicated passing across his face. "And you deserve to hear it somewhere other than in front of these people." The priest, who had been standing frozen at the altar this entire time, finally found his voice. "Perhaps we should postpone this ceremony indefinitely," he said quietly, "under the circumstances." "There won't be a ceremony at all," Richard said flatly. "Hardy, you're going to leave, now, and take your mother with you." "You can't order me around," Monique sputtered. "This is my son's wedding." "There is no wedding," Richard said. Your son already made that clear when he abandoned his fiancé 30 minutes before the ceremony. The only question now is whether you leave on your own or whether I make several calls that will ensure neither you nor Hardy can show your faces in polite society again." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Hardy's face had gone white. Monique looked like she wanted to argue further, but something in Richard's expression convinced her otherwise. "Fine," she spat, "but this isn't over." "Actually," Richard said quietly, "it is." Mother and son retreated up the aisle, Monique's heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. The guests shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether they should stay or leave. Most began gathering their belongings. The awkward shuffle of people desperate to escape an uncomfortable situation. Within minutes, the church had emptied except for Jillian, Richard, and the two little girls. The silence felt overwhelming after all the chaos. "I'm sorry," Jillian said finally, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. "I should go. I don't know what I need to do." "Look at Dorothy," Richard said gently. Jillian's gaze dropped to the little girl, who had moved even closer now, standing right beside Jillian's wheelchair. The child reached out tentatively and touched Jillian's hand. "Your hands are cold," Dorothy observed. Then, more quietly, "But they feel familiar." Jillian's heart stuttered in her chest. "What?" Richard knelt again, this time at eye level with both Jillian and Dorothy. His expression was serious, almost pained. "7 years ago," he said carefully, "there was a car accident, a terrible one. You were in that accident, Jillian. And so was your daughter." The world tilted sideways. "My daughter died in that accident," Jillian whispered. "They told me. The doctor said—" "They were wrong," Richard said. "Or they lied. I'm not sure which yet." He looked at Dorothy, then back at Jillian. "Because the child you lost isn't lost." Rain began to pour outside the church as the truth started to unfold. Drops hammering against the stained glass windows like 1,000 urgent warnings that had come too late. Jillian couldn't breathe. The words Richard had just spoken, "The child you lost isn't lost," hung in the air between them, impossible and terrifying and too fragile to touch. "I don't understand," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter died. They told me she died." Richard's jaw tightened. 7 years ago, on October 14th, 2016, I was driving back from a business meeting in Savannah. It was late, around 11 at night, and raining just like this. He gestured toward the windows. I came across a car accident on Highway 17, a bad one, the kind where you know immediately that lives have been lost. Jillian's hands began to shake. October 14th, 2016. The date was burned into her memory like a brand. "The emergency responders hadn't arrived yet," Richard continued. "I stopped to help. There was a woman in the driver's seat. She wasn't conscious. The car was crushed on the driver's side, and there was so much blood." He paused, his expression pained. "I thought she was dead. Everyone thought she was dead." "That was me," Jillian breathed. "That was my car." "I know that now," Richard said. "But in that moment, all I knew was that I heard crying. A baby, screaming from the back seat. The car was smoking. I was terrified it might catch fire, so I broke the rear window and pulled her out." Dorothy, who had been listening with wide, serious eyes, pressed closer to Jillian's wheelchair. "The paramedics arrived just as I got her clear of the wreck," Richard said. "They rushed the woman, you, to the hospital in critical condition. The baby had some cuts and bruises but seemed otherwise unharmed. I rode with her in the ambulance because there was no one else. No identification was found at the scene initially. Your purse had been thrown from the car. In the chaos, the hospital assumed the baby's mother had died." "But I didn't die," Jillian said, tears streaming down her face. "I woke up 3 days later, and they told me my baby was gone, that she hadn't survived." "Someone lied to you," Richard said, and there was controlled fury beneath his calm tone. "Or made a catastrophic error. I don't know which yet, but when I tried to find the infant's family, when I contacted the hospital, they told me there were no survivors except the mother, and she was in a coma with severe spinal injuries." They said the baby had been someone else's child, a victim from another accident that same night. Jillian pressed her hands to her mouth, sobs building in her chest. I didn't believe it felt wrong, Richard continued, but I had no way to prove otherwise. No DNA matches in the system, no missing persons reports that fit. So I made a choice. I adopted her, raised her alongside my niece Yvonne after my sister passed away. I gave her the best life I could, and I named her Dorothy. The little girl looked up at Jillian with those familiar brown eyes, and suddenly Jillian saw it. The shape of her nose, the curve of her lips, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. Your left shoulder, Jillian said suddenly, her voice cracking. Is there a birthmark? Small, shaped like a crescent moon? Richard's expression shifted. He glanced at Dorothy, who nodded solemnly and pulled down the edge of her crimson dress, just enough to reveal a small, pale mark on her shoulder. Jillian's world shattered and reformed in the same instant. That's my daughter, she whispered. That's my baby. The memory came flooding back, sharp and devastating. She'd been 23 years old, working double shifts as a nurse at Mercy General Hospital because the pay was barely enough to cover rent and groceries. Hardy had been charming then, before the distance crept in, before the resentment. They'd been planning a small wedding, something simple and sweet. Then she'd gotten pregnant. Hardy had been supportive at first, or so she'd told herself. But there had been something in his eyes even then, something that looked like doubt, like he was calculating whether she was worth the trouble. The night of October 14th, she'd been driving home from her shift, exhausted. Thinking about the nursery she'd started setting up in the corner of their tiny apartment, thinking about the life growing inside her, 6 weeks old and perfect. Then there had been headlights, too bright, too close, coming from the wrong direction. The impact had been instant and total. Metal screaming, glass shattering, her body thrown against the steering wheel despite the seatbelt, pain everywhere, worse than anything she'd ever imagined. And then nothing. She'd woken up 3 days later in a hospital bed, unable to feel her legs. A doctor with kind eyes and terrible news had sat beside her and explained that her spine had been crushed, that she would never walk again, that they'd tried to save the baby, but Jillian had screamed. She'd screamed until her throat was raw and her voice was gone. Hardy had visited once, held her hand for 10 minutes while staring at the wall. Then he'd left and didn't come back for a week. Looking back now, she should have known then that he'd already started leaving her. Jillian? Richard's voice pulled her back to the present. To the church, to the rain, to Dorothy standing right in front of her, real and alive and here. I'm sorry, Jillian managed. I was just remembering. Take your time, Richard said gently. But Dorothy didn't wait. The little girl stepped forward and, without hesitation, wrapped her small arms around Jillian's shoulders. The hug was fierce and certain, like something her body remembered, even if her mind didn't. Don't cry, Dorothy whispered against Jillian's neck. It's okay now. Jillian broke. 7 years of grief and loss, and believing her child was gone, came pouring out in great, shaking sobs. She wrapped her arms around Dorothy and held her like she might disappear if Jillian let go. I looked for you, Jillian whispered brokenly. I asked so many times. They kept telling me you were gone. I tried to believe them. I tried to move on, but I never stopped missing you. Never stopped hoping I was wrong. Dorothy pulled back just enough to look at Jillian's face. She reached up with one small hand and wiped tears from Jillian's cheek. You smell like home, Dorothy said, her voice soft and wondering. I don't know why, but you do. Jillian's heart broke and mended in the same moment. Richard stood nearby, watching with an expression that was part relief, part resolve. He'd promised himself something in that moment, standing in the church while rain pounded against the windows and a mother held her lost daughter for the first time in 7 years. No one would hurt Jillian Johnson again. Not Hardy, not Monique, not whoever had stolen those 7 years from both Jillian and Dorothy. He'd find the truth. He'd find proof. And he'd make sure justice came for everyone who'd played a part in this tragedy. But first, he'd give them this moment, this reunion, this miracle. Because some things were more important than revenge. By nightfall, rumors of the ruined wedding spread through Charleston like wildfire. Jillian Johnson, the disabled bride humiliated at the altar. Richard Baker, the billionaire who'd stopped a wedding and made shocking claims about a lost child. Hardy Smith, the coward who'd abandoned his fiancé in front of God and everyone. By the time the sun set over the harbor, half the city was talking about it. But Jillian heard none of the gossip. She was miles away from St. Catherine's Church, sitting in a room so large and beautiful it felt like something from a dream. Richard's estate was everything she'd expected from a billionaire's home, and nothing like she'd imagined at the same time. The furniture was expensive but comfortable. The decor was elegant but lived in. It felt like a home, not a museum. Dorothy hadn't left her side since they'd arrived. The little girl sat curled against Jillian on the enormous leather sofa, one small hand holding tight to Jillian's fingers, as if afraid she might vanish. Yvonne, her twin in appearance but not blood, sat nearby with a book, occasionally glancing up at Jillian with cautious curiosity. "You're safe here," Richard said, entering the room with 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Jillian, his expression gentle. "No one gets onto this property without my permission. Not Hardy, not his mother, no one." "Thank you," Jillian said quietly. The words felt inadequate for what he'd done, but they were all she had. "I still don't understand why you're helping me." "Because it's the right thing to do," Richard said simply. "And because Dorothy deserves to know her mother." He paused, his expression darkening. "And because someone needs to answer for what was done to you." Before Jillian could respond, there was a knock at the door. Richard's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, becoming more guarded. "That'll be Robert," he said. "Robert?" "Someone who might have answers," Richard said carefully. "Someone who owes me several favors, and someone whose past intersects with yours in ways you're not going to like." The door opened, and a man entered. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered and scarred, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of a life lived in shadows. His suit was expensive but worn with the ease of someone who didn't care about impressing anyone. When his eyes landed on Jillian, he stopped dead. "Jesus Christ," he said, his voice rough. "It's really her." "Robert Taylor," Richard said, his tone formal and cold. "Meet Jillian Johnson." Robert stared at her like he was seeing a ghost. "I know who she is," he said quietly. "I've known for 7 years." Jillian's stomach dropped. "What?" Robert crossed the room slowly, keeping his distance as if afraid he might contaminate her with his presence. "You were a nurse at Mercy General," he said. "You worked the overnight shift. You drove a blue Honda Civic. And on October 14th, 2016, you were run off Highway 17 by one of my men." The room went silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantel. "Your men," Jillian repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was in a different line of work back then," Robert said. "The kind that doesn't ask questions when someone pays enough money. A woman came to me with a job. She wanted someone scared. Roughed up a little, sent a message. She said the target was a gold digger trying to trap her son into marriage. She said it needed to look like an accident." Horror crawled up Jillian's spine. "Monique." Robert nodded grimly. "Monique Smith. She paid $20,000 to have you run off the road. Nothing fatal," she said. "Just enough to put you in the hospital for a while. Make you think twice about marrying her precious boy." His jaw tightened. "But my guy panicked. Hit you harder than planned. By the time I heard what happened, that you were paralyzed, that there'd been a baby, it was too late to fix it." Jillian couldn't breathe. The room spun around her. Everything she'd believed about that night, random chance, terrible luck, a tragic accident, had been a lie. "She tried to kill me," Jillian whispered. "She tried to hurt you," Robert corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless. "The death of your mobility, the baby. That wasn't supposed to happen. But it did. And when I realized what we'd done..." He stopped, his expression haunted. "I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of. But that was the one that made me get out of the business. That was the one I couldn't live with." Richard's hand settled on Jillian's shoulder, steadying her. "That's why I asked him here," he said quietly. "Robert came to me 6 months ago, trying to make amends for his past. When I told him about Dorothy, about you, he recognized your name immediately. And now you want to use him to expose Monique," Jillian said, understanding dawning through her shock. "I want justice," Richard said. "For you, for Dorothy, for the 7 years you lost." Robert stepped closer, his expression earnest. "I'll testify. I'll give you everything. Bank records, communications, names of everyone involved. Monique Smith tried to destroy your life, and I helped her do it. That needs to be made right." Jillian looked down at Dorothy, who had gone very quiet, her small face pressed against Jillian's side. The little girl didn't fully understand what was being discussed, but she sensed the weight of it. "You survived what was meant to destroy you," Richard said softly, kneeling beside the sofa so he was eye level with Jillian. "That matters. You're stronger than anyone who tried to break you." Tears slid down Jillian's face, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of fury, of determination. For 7 years, she'd blamed herself for not being enough, for not fighting harder to find her daughter, for not being strong enough to keep Hardy's love, for being broken. But she wasn't broken. She'd been sabotaged, and the woman who'd done it was still out there, free and unpunished, probably sleeping soundly in her expensive bed. "I want her to pay," Jillian said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Not just for me, for Dorothy, for every year she stole from us." "She will," Richard promised. Robert nodded. "I'll make sure of it, whatever it takes." But then his expression darkened, something troubled passing across his weathered features. "There's something else you need to know," he said. "Monique didn't act alone. She had help covering this up. People in the hospital, people in law enforcement, people with enough power to make records disappear and questions go unanswered." "Who?" Richard demanded. "I don't know all the names," Robert admitted. "But I know they're still around, still loyal to her, still invested in making sure the truth stays buried." He looked at Jillian, his expression grave. "Going after Monique means going after them too. And these aren't people who take threats lightly. They've killed for less." The warning hung in the air like smoke. Dorothy clutched Jillian tighter, and Jillian wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her close. "I don't care," Jillian said quietly. "Let them come." Redemption, Jillian learned, didn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It came in small moments, quiet victories, and the gradual rebuilding of a life she'd thought was irreparably broken. 3 weeks after the ruined wedding, she sat in the sun-filled therapy room of Richard's charitable foundation, surrounded by children whose lives looked different from what they'd once imagined. Kids in wheelchairs, kids with prosthetics, kids learning to navigate a world that hadn't been built with them in mind. "Does it get easier?" a 10-year-old girl named Maya asked, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair with the uncertainty of someone still learning. "Moving around in this thing?" Jillian smiled. "It gets different," she said honestly. "Some days are harder than others, but you learn, you adapt, and eventually the chair stops being something that holds you back and starts being something that helps you move forward. Even when people stare?" "Especially when people stare," Jillian said, "because their stares say more about them than they do about you." Maya considered this, then nodded slowly. "Miss Jill," she said, using the name Yvonne had started calling her, and that had spread through the foundation like wildfire. "Were you always this brave?" The question hit harder than Jillian expected. "No," she admitted. "I spent a long time being scared, but bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing things anyway." From the doorway, Richard watched with an expression that made Jillian's heart do complicated things. He'd been doing that lately, appearing at random moments, watching her work with the kids, his admiration barely concealed. "You're good at this," he said later that evening as they shared dinner in his study. It had become a routine over the past weeks. After the twins went to bed, Richard and Jillian would sit together, talking about everything and nothing. "The kids love you. They remind me why I became a nurse," Jillian said. I wanted to help people. I'd forgotten that somewhere along the way. Richard poured her more wine, his movements careful and deliberate. You help people now. Maybe not in the way you originally planned, but you do. Thanks to you, Jillian said, for giving me this chance, for everything. Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them. It had been building for weeks. This awareness, this connection that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Jillian, Richard started, but he was interrupted by Dorothy bursting through the study door in her pajamas, Yvonne trailing behind with an apologetic expression. Mommy Jill! Dorothy climbed into Jillian's lap without hesitation. I had a bad dream. Can you tell me a story? Mommy Jill. The name still made Jillian's throat tight with emotion every time she heard it. Of course, sweetheart, Jillian said, wrapping her arms around her daughter. What kind of story? One with a happy ending, Dorothy said seriously, where the princess gets to keep her family forever. Richard's expression softened as he watched them, and Jillian thought, not for the first time, that she was falling for this man who'd saved her daughter, given her purpose, and looked at her like she was something precious. But happiness, Jillian was learning, was never allowed to exist without someone trying to destroy it. The lawsuits arrived the next morning. Monique Smith, through a team of expensive lawyers, filed defamation charges against both Jillian and Richard. The claims were vicious and calculated, that Jillian had seduced Richard for money, that she'd fabricated the story about Dorothy to extort the Baker family, that she was a gold digger who'd staged the entire wedding disaster for attention and sympathy. The local papers picked it up immediately. Within hours, Jillian's face was plastered across social media with captions like, Disabled Bride's Shocking Con, and Billionaire's New Girlfriend, Love or Lawsuit. They're destroying me, Jillian said, staring at her phone screen with growing horror. Everything I've built here, They're trying to, Richard corrected, his voice hard with controlled anger. But they won't succeed. We have the truth on our side. But the truth felt fragile compared to Monique's money and connections. The rumors spread like poison. Parents at the foundation started pulling their children from programs. Donors called to express concerns. Even some of Richard's business partners suggested he distance himself from the situation. Hardy appeared at the estate gates one evening, looking haggard and desperate. Richard refused to let him in, but Jillian, against her better judgment, agreed to speak with him through the intercom. Jillian, please, Hardy's voice crackled through the speaker. I need to talk to you. I think my mother lied to me about everything. You think? Jillian's voice was ice. The night of your accident, Hardy continued, and she could hear tears in his voice now. I was at the hospital. My mother pulled me aside and told me the baby didn't survive. She said the doctors had confirmed it. She said it would be easier for both of us if we just moved forward, started fresh once you recovered. And you believed her. I was 24 years old and terrified, Hardy said. My girlfriend was paralyzed. My mother was the only person who seemed to know what to do. So yes, I believed her. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I needed you to know that I didn't know Dorothy was alive. If I had... But you didn't fight for me either, Jillian said quietly. Even before you knew about Dorothy. You saw me in that wheelchair and you started pulling away. Your mother just gave you permission to do what you already wanted. The silence that followed was answer enough. Goodbye, Hardy, Jillian said, and disconnected the call. That night, Robert arrived with a briefcase full of evidence. Bank statements showing payments from Monique to Robert's organization. Emails discussing the accident. Hospital records that had been altered. Testimonies from staff who'd been paid to lie. This is enough to bury her, Robert said, spreading the documents across Richard's desk. Not just civil charges, criminal conspiracy, attempted murder, obstruction of justice. She's looking at serious prison time. Richard studied the evidence with the focused intensity of a man planning war. The Harrington Charity Gala is in 2 weeks, he said. 500 guests, every major name in Charleston society, full media coverage. You want to expose her there, Jillian said, understanding. I want to show everyone exactly who Monique Smith is, Richard confirmed. In front of witnesses, she can't intimidate or buy off. On a stage, she can't escape. She'll fight back, Jillian warned. Hard. Let her try, Richard said, his expression dangerous. I'm done playing nice. But Jillian felt the fear creeping in. The gala meant public attention. Cameras, scrutiny. Standing before the same society that had whispered about her humiliation and accused her of being a fraud. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted quietly. Be in front of all those people. Have them stare at me again. Richard crossed to her wheelchair and knelt. The gesture so familiar now it felt like coming home. You don't have to, he said gently. We can find another way. But Jillian thought of Dorothy, calling her Mommy Jill with absolute trust. She thought of Maya and the other kids at the foundation who saw her as proof that their lives could still be beautiful. She thought of every moment Monique had tried to erase her from existence. No, Jillian said, steel entering her voice. I want them to see me stand tall, even if it's from a chair. 2 weeks later, Jillian sat in front of her mirror wearing a crimson gown that matched the ones Dorothy and Yvonne wore. The color of courage, Richard had called it when he'd had the dresses made. Her hair was styled elegantly. Her makeup was perfect. And when she looked at her reflection, she didn't see a victim anymore. I'm not your victim anymore, she whispered to the woman in the mirror, and to Monique wherever she was. And tonight, everyone will know it. The ballroom glittered like something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across polished marble floors. Guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos sipped champagne from delicate flutes, their laughter echoing off gilded walls. The Harrington Charity Gala was the social event of the season, and no one in attendance had any idea that the night would end in scandal. Jillian's hands trembled slightly on the wheels of her chair as Richard guided her through the entrance. She'd expected stares. She always got stares, but the weight of 500 pairs of eyes landing on her simultaneously was something else entirely. That's her, someone whispered. The poor bride from the broken wedding. I heard she's trying to trap Richard Baker the same way she tried to trap Hardy Smith. Shameless, really, using a wheelchair for sympathy. Richard's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steady. Ignore them, he murmured. You're the most beautiful woman in this room, and they know it. Jillian looked up at him. This man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she hadn't known how to pray, and found her courage. Let's give them something worth talking about, she said. They moved through the crowd, Richard's presence alone enough to part the sea of Charleston's elite. Dorothy and Yvonne walked on either side of Jillian's chair, the three of them in matching crimson gowns, a united front that drew admiring glances and envious whispers. Near the bar, Jillian caught sight of Robert Taylor, dressed in a server's uniform, blending into the shadows. He met her eyes briefly and nodded. Security, protection, insurance that Monique's allies wouldn't try anything reckless. And then she appeared. Monique Smith entered the ballroom like she owned it, dripping in pearls and confidence. Her navy gown was couture, her hair perfectly coiffed, her smile sharp as cut glass. She was surrounded by allies, society matrons and business magnates who'd built their fortunes on maintaining the status quo. When Monique's gaze landed on Jillian, her smile widened into something predatory. "Richard," she called out, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "How lovely to see you. And Miss Johnson, of course. How brave of you to show your face after those unfortunate rumors." Jillian's grip tightened on her wheels, but she kept her expression calm. "Hello, Monique. Lovely event. Isn't it?" Monique's eyes glittered with malice. "Though I must say I'm surprised the organizers allowed just anyone to attend. Standards have clearly slipped." Several guests gasped at the blatant insult. Richard's expression went dangerously cold. "Careful, Monique," he said quietly. "You're about to have a very bad evening." Before she could respond, the lights dimmed. A spotlight illuminated the stage at the front of the ballroom, where a microphone stood waiting. Richard squeezed Jillian's shoulder once, then walked toward the stage with the confident stride of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Good evening, everyone, Richard's voice echoed through the sound system. Thank you for attending tonight's gala. Your generosity supports causes that change lives. Medical research, disability advocacy, support for families in crisis. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Tonight I'm pleased to announce a special donation, Richard continued. $5 million to establish the Dorothy Johnson Memorial Fund for accident survivors and their families. Jillian's breath caught. Dorothy, seated beside her, looked up with wide eyes. The fund is named for my daughter, Richard said, who survived a terrible car accident 7 years ago, an accident that was meant to destroy her mother's life, an accident that wasn't an accident at all. The murmuring began immediately. Richard pulled out a remote, and a screen descended behind him. Images appeared. Bank statements, emails, hospital records. 7 years ago, Monique Smith paid $20,000 to have Jillian Johnson run off the road, Richard said, his voice cutting through the rising noise. The goal was to scare her away from Monique's son. The result was a young woman paralyzed, a baby presumed dead, and 7 years of lies designed to keep the truth buried. Cameras flashed. Guests surged forward. Monique's face drained of color. These are the bank transfers, Richard continued, images cycling on the screen. These are the communications with Robert Taylor's organization. These are the hospital records that were falsified to hide the fact that Jillian's daughter survived. And these, he held up a folder, are sworn testimonies from everyone involved. This is slander, Monique shrieked, her composure shattering. Lies from a gold digger and her billionaire sugar daddy. Then explain the paper trail, Richard said coldly. Explain why your signature is on these documents. Explain why 12 witnesses are prepared to testify under oath about your role in attempting to murder Jillian Johnson. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Society matrons clutched their pearls. Business magnates pulled out their phones. And at the back of the room, 2 police officers appeared, moving purposefully through the crowd. Monique saw them and panicked. You can't do this to me, she screamed, pointing at Jillian with a trembling hand. She ruined my family. She was nothing, a poor nurse trying to trap my son into poverty. I was protecting him. By trying to kill me? Jillian's voice cut through the noise, clear and strong. She wheeled herself toward the center of the ballroom, and the crowd parted around her. By stealing 7 years with my daughter? By letting me believe my child was dead while you slept peacefully in your mansion? You're broken, Monique spat. Damaged. My son deserved better than... You broke my body, Jillian said calmly, and the entire ballroom went silent. But not my spirit. And that's what makes me whole. The applause started slowly. One person, then another, then a wave of sound that filled the ballroom. People were standing now, clapping, some openly crying. The police reached Monique, handcuffs gleaming in the chandelier light. Monique Smith, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit attempted murder, obstruction of justice, and fraud. Monique's screams echoed as she was led away. Her perfect facade finally shattered beyond repair. In the chaos, Hardy appeared. He looked smaller than Jillian remembered, broken by guilt and shame. He approached her wheelchair slowly, tears streaming down his face. Jillian, he choked out, I'm so sorry. I should have known. I should have protected you. I was weak and stupid, and please, can you ever forgive me? Jillian looked at him, this man who'd promised forever and delivered betrayal, and felt only pity. I forgive you, she said quietly. Not for you, for me, because I'm not carrying that weight anymore. Hardy sobbed, but Jillian had already turned away. Richard approached, and the crowd seemed to sense something was happening because the noise died down once more. He knelt beside her wheelchair in front of 500 witnesses, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. You were never broken, Jillian, he said softly. The world just couldn't see your light. Richard. But before she could finish, Dorothy and Yvonne rushed forward from where they'd been standing with Robert. They carried between them a hand-painted sign. decorated with hearts and flowers and glitter that would probably never come out of the ballroom carpet. The sign read, "Mommy, will you marry Daddy?" The ballroom erupted again. Gasps, applause, excited chatter. Jillian looked from the sign to the twins to Richard, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Is this real?" she whispered. "It's the most real thing I've ever done," Richard said. From his pocket, he pulled a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a ring that caught the light like captured starfire. "I'm not asking you to marry me because you need saving. I'm asking because I love you, because you make me better, because Dorothy deserves to have her mother be part of our family in every way." "Yes," Jillian said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, yes." Richard slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her while 500 people cheered and cameras captured the moment that would replace every terrible rumor with a story of redemption. The poor bride who'd been humiliated had found her happy ending after all. 1 year later. Ocean waves at sunrise. Jillian in her wedding gown again. This time, radiant, peaceful, loved. The beach stretched endlessly before her. Golden sand meeting turquoise water under a sky painted in shades of coral and lavender. It was early enough that the world still felt quiet, sacred, like a secret being whispered between the ocean and the heavens. Jillian sat in her wheelchair at the edge of the water, her dress, a simple, elegant gown of ivory silk, pooling around her like sea foam. Her hair was loose, threaded with small white flowers that Dorothy had insisted on weaving in herself that morning. No elaborate updo, no heavy makeup, just Jillian, exactly as she was, exactly as Richard loved her. This time, there would be no grand church, no society guests whispering behind their programs, no cruel words or public humiliation. This time, it was just them. "Are you ready?" Richard appeared beside her, devastatingly handsome in a simple white shirt and linen pants, barefoot like she was. His eyes held that soft warmth she'd grown to cherish, the look that said she was his entire world. "I've been ready for a year," Jillian said, smiling up at him. Dorothy and Yvonne ran ahead of them, both in flowing white dresses, their dark hair streaming behind them like ribbons. They carried baskets of rose petals, scattering them across the sand in a makeshift aisle that led to where a minister waited under a simple wooden arch decorated with flowing white fabric and tropical flowers. "Mommy, look!" Dorothy called, tossing petals into the air with abandon. "We're making it beautiful for you." "It's perfect, sweetheart," Jillian called back, her heart swelling. Richard pushed her wheelchair gently across the sand, not because she couldn't do it herself, but because he wanted to. Because this was their moment, and he wanted to be the one to bring her to the altar this time. A small gathering of people waited near the arch. Richard's business partner and closest friend stood ready to serve as best man. Jillian's sister Naomi, who'd flown in from Seattle, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. And there, standing slightly apart from the others, was Robert Taylor. The former crime boss looked older now, the weight of his guilt etched into the lines of his face. But when his eyes met Jillian's, she saw something else there too. Gratitude, relief, peace. After Monique's arrest, Robert had turned state's evidence, providing testimony that had ensured Monique's conviction on multiple charges. She was serving 15 years in federal prison, her empire of cruelty finally dismantled. Robert had spent the past year doing community service, speaking at youth centers about the cost of living a criminal life, trying to atone for decades of darkness. Jillian had visited him 3 months ago. She'd wheeled herself into the community center where he was speaking and waited until he was finished. When he'd seen her, he'd frozen, terrified. "I came to say thank you," she'd told him, "for telling the truth, for helping me get justice, for giving me back my daughter." Robert had wept like a child. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," Jillian had said, "but I'm giving it anyway, because holding on to hate was killing me, and I choose to live now." Now, as she passed him on the way to the altar, she reached out and squeezed his hand briefly. He nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face, and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Further back, almost hidden behind a cluster of palm trees, stood Hardy. He'd asked permission to attend, not to disrupt, just to witness. To see Jillian happy, to finally, truly let her go. Richard had wanted to refuse, but Jillian had said yes, because Hardy was part of her story, even if he was no longer part of her future. Because seeing him there, broken and humbled, proved to her that she'd moved beyond the girl who'd once loved him. She was someone else now, someone stronger, someone whole. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. The minister spoke about love that heals, about second chances, about finding light in the darkest moments. Richard's vows made her cry, promises about choosing her every day, about building a life that honored both their strengths and their struggles, about loving not despite the wheelchair, but because she was Jillian, and Jillian was everything. When it was her turn, Jillian looked into his eyes and spoke from her heart. "A year ago, I sat in a church and believed my life was over," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. My mobility, my child, my future. But I was wrong. I hadn't lost everything. I just hadn't found you yet." Richard's eyes glistened. "You didn't save me," Jillian continued. "You showed me I'd already saved myself. You gave me back my daughter, yes. But more than that, you gave me back my belief that I deserved to be loved, not pitied, not tolerated. Loved, completely, exactly as I am." She glanced at Dorothy and Yvonne, who were watching with rapt attention. "I promise to be the mother your daughters deserve, the partner you need, the woman who stands beside you, even when that standing happens from a chair. I promise to choose you, every single day, for the rest of my life." There wasn't a dry eye on the beach. The minister pronounced them married, and Richard leaned down to kiss her as the waves crashed softly behind them, and the twins cheered, and the sunrise painted everything gold. Later, after photographs and laughter and a small celebration breakfast, Jillian found herself alone at the water's edge again. Richard had taken the girls to hunt for seashells, giving her a moment of quiet reflection. She thought about the Jillian who'd sat in that church garden a year ago, sobbing in her wedding dress, believing she was unlovable. She thought about the nights spent wondering if her daughter had suffered, if she'd cried for a mother who couldn't come. She thought about the wheelchair that had once felt like a prison, and now simply felt like part of who she was. The Dorothy Project had opened 6 months ago, a foundation providing support, resources, and funding for disabled mothers and their children. Jillian ran it with the same passion she'd once brought to nursing, and it had already helped dozens of families who'd felt lost and forgotten by a system that didn't see them. She'd taken her pain and turned it into purpose. Her tragedy had become someone else's hope. "Mommy," Dorothy's voice rang out across the beach. "Come see what we found." Jillian smiled and turned her chair toward her family. Richard appeared beside her, slightly breathless from chasing energetic 7-year-olds. He knelt in the sand, bringing himself to her level, and took her hand. "You're not just my bride," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my miracle." Jillian reached up and touched his face. This man who'd walked into her worst moment and refused to leave. "And you're the reason I finally believe in fate," she said. The waves crashed softly. The twins laughed nearby, their joy carried on the ocean breeze. And Jillian looked at the horizon, endless and beautiful and full of possibility. She was no longer trapped by what she'd lost. She was free because of what she'd found. A daughter who called her mommy. A man who loved her completely. A purpose that gave meaning to her pain. And a future that stretched before her like the ocean itself. Vast, beautiful, and entirely her own. The poor bride who'd been humiliated had become something far greater. She'd become whole, not in spite of her wheelchair, but because she'd finally learned that her worth had never been tied to her ability to walk. It had always been there, waiting for her to see it, waiting for her to believe it. And now, finally, she did. The miracle wasn't that she'd survived. The miracle was that she'd learned to truly live.